Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Chatham House. I think, let's get started. Also, welcome to our online participants. Thank you for joining today on our event on the Global Plastics Treaty. The negotiations for this will continue in a few weeks in Geneva, and I will start with doing some housekeeping. Then I'll give some more background on, very briefly, the work that Chatham House has been doing on Plastics Treaty, and then I'll introduce our panel, both here and online. In terms of housekeeping, so the event is not under the Chatham House rule, so it's on the record. You feel free to share any insights. We encourage also, if you want to share this on social media, this is all possible. We do the first half hour will be opening remarks from the panelists. Then we do about 30 minutes discussion. I've prepared some questions. And then the last half hour, we welcome questions from you and from the online audience. So they will come through on here. So we hope to have a good engagement also with you on this topic of plastics pollution and the treaty. You might know in 2022 at the United Nations Environment Assembly there was a resolution to address this global issue of worsening plastics pollution, and that initiated a process called the INC, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, and Ambassador Vyas is chair of that process. And we will hear more from you about this in a minute. Here at Chatham House, what we've tried to do on the sidelines to support the process, for instance, in 2023, we supported the UK government and the Brazilian government to host an informal technical dialogue with about 40 experts internationally on topics around criteria on problematic plastics, potentially to develop lists of products that should be phased out. We tried to also do this to support the treaty. Then we also worked together with UNIDO and the Moroccan government to convene stakeholders from the African Union on standards for recycling of PET for plastics bottles. And then more recently, we've engaged with the International Science Council to support and promote a science-based approach to the treaty and to achieve an outcome. So that's some of the work we've done, and so it's a great pleasure that today we have this panel to discuss more on the negotiations and to hear from people directly involved on the latest insights and how to find the way forward to deliver a promising outcome to this negotiations. I'll just introduce the panel, and so we have His Excellency Ambassador Luis Vyas Valdivieso, who's the Ambassador of Ecuador to the UK and chair of the INC negotiation process. Then online, Margaret Spring, Chief Science and Conservation Officer, Monterey Bay Aquarium, and Margaret also leads the expert group on plastics pollution of the International Science Council. Then we have Dr. Suvendra Michael from Fiji. He's Permanent Secretary for the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change in Fiji. And it's very early for you, so thank you again for joining. And Her Excellency Sophia Soni, Special Envoy and Ambassador for Climate of Grenada, and also Special Advisor to the Minister of Climate, Resilience, Environment and Renewable Energy. Also, it's early for you as well. Thank you for joining. And then finally, Jeremy Blake, here in person, Director of Circular Economy at Amcor. And Amcor also being a member of the Business Coalition for Global Plastics Treaty. So we have representatives from the negotiations, from the UN, science and business, all really important stakeholders in making this treaty work. But so that's enough for me. I hand over to you, Ambassador, for your opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick, and good afternoon to all of you. And well, actually, good morning and good evening to our colleagues also that are online. And thank you so much for organizing this very important panel here in Chatham House. I think this event is very important also because of the event, of course, but also because of the crucial moment that we are now in the negotiations in our way to our last meeting or last session in Geneva in August now, as you mentioned. And thank you so much. Also, nice to see here Jeremy, and like you have introduced also Michael, Margaret, and Safia, dear colleagues and dear friends also, that to share this panel with you is really an honor, and so nice. I can see familiar faces here, and happy to present my perspective, what I'm expecting about these negotiations, what I think we will see in Geneva, what we are doing now, what we have done until now in our negotiations, but of course ready also to answer your questions and hear your comments. As Patrick mentioned, 3 years ago, but a bit more than 3 years ago, March 2022, the UNEA, that's the UN General Assembly of Environment, adopted a resolution number 514. That is a bit of a coincidence, you know, the meeting will be from the 5th of August to the 14th of August.
Oh,
that is also 514. Maybe a good sign.
And there's also UNEA 5.2, and this will be INC 5.2.
Exactly, and we are to INC 5.2 too. Anyhow, the resolution has a clear mandate for members, for the UN members, the countries, to negotiate a legally binding international instrument on plastic pollution. The aim that you will see in that resolution was to finish our negotiations by the end of 2024. We didn't manage. Actually, our last session, INC 5.1, was in Busan, in the Republic of Korea, last year, between the end of November, beginning of December. That, for me, actually, it was the best INC, because we did progress a lot. It's true. We didn't finish. We didn't close the negotiations. We didn't fulfill, in somehow, Resolution 514 in Busan, but we did advance a lot. And we did advance a lot if you check, if you see also the results of previous INCs. The one before Busan was in Ottawa, INC 4, where we did advance, where we start negotiating on textual negotiations. That's what we do, negotiators. But it was not until Busan that we advanced in the text. Before Busan, I present to the members a series of iterations of non-papers proposing text to the members from my side as chair. And during Busan, I did also present two chair's texts. Actually, the last one that I presented, the 1st of December last year, it was agreed to be our starting point of negotiations in our next session. So we have the chair's text from 1st of December as the starting point of our negotiations now that will be in Geneva. So I tell you this because from my side, as chair, I have presented this text to the members. But now, right after Busan, I request, I suggest, I encourage members to take this negotiation, this text, and own this text, to have the ownership of this text in the member side. And it has happened. And actually, I'm quite thankful to the members. I have seen very important meetings, exchange of views, exchange of positions, and trying to find what is very important for me, thinking in our negotiations in Geneva, that is to find common grounds, to find alternatives of landing zones, to use them in Geneva. That will be very important, because we have heard our positions. We have heard the position from countries, from members, from group of countries during this whole process. Now it's time to show members, to show their skills in negotiations, to show flexibility, to find that common ground, and to deliver, as you have said, in Geneva, the 14th of August. So that will be important. A few days ago, we had a heads of delegation meeting in Nairobi, and it was a very important meeting because for me it was a barometer of what we could see in Geneva. It was an important meeting because we gave the space to members to exchange also proposals that we have seen from these gatherings, from these meetings that countries they have had during this intersessional period between Busan and Geneva. We saw the exchange of some proposals, text proposals from different articles. And when I say that we did advance a lot, actually, in Busan, I mean that we could see, well, with different levels of convergence, but we could see a high level of convergence in the majority of the articles in this future text. Still some issues. We are still to work with some challenges that we have in front of us. Well, I'm sure all of you, or the majority of you, you are quite familiar with the negotiations, and you know where the challenges are. Actually, 3 articles, but 3 articles that are linked to others when we talk about production, when we talk about chemicals of concern, or when we talk about the financial mechanism that we need to implement this instrument. I think, and I'm optimist, that we will find a way out, that we will find a way out not only to have the instrument, but to have an effective text, an effective legally binding instrument that will combat and will end plastic pollution. We need to have in mind a couple of things. The first one is that it should be an effective text. It should be a text that is not only effective, as we will see in Geneva, but also it will be effective in its implementation. It has to be implementable. It has to be a text that countries take it, that when some country, well, I hope many countries will ratify, not too many years from now, that could implement, could harmonize the national legislation and implement and work with this text. And the second part is that this text, this future legally binding instrument, needs to be alive in the future. Needs to be a text that will strengthen in the future, that we will have still a text that will be working from here in 10 years, in 20 years, because yes, we would like to end plastic pollution as soon as possible, but yes, we need to prevent that this will happen again in the world. We need to also take into consideration the legacy plastic that we have in the ocean. So there are different aspects, and for that, we need you. From where it came, this negotiation? Yes, it was from members that we start talking about in Basel Convention about the need of this instrument. But it came from you. It came from the civil society representatives. It came from NGOs. It came from the scientific community. It was, you were the first ones to start talking about this. And then members, it took maybe for me too much. It took some years until we, the members, took it and started negotiating this instrument that we should have had it many, many years ago. Anyhow, to tell you that it's important also the civil society representatives, stakeholders, observers, private sector in these negotiations, but it will be very important also for the implementation later on, and also before even that we start implementing the text in the interim period between Geneva and the diplomatic conference, and between the diplomatic conference and the first COP, we need to keep working. It's not that the next, let's hope that it won't be more than 3 years until this future instrument enters into force, but also in that interim period, we need to work also. Countries, stakeholders, observers, scientific community, we need to keep working together also to make it implementable and to implement it as soon as possible. With those words, once again, thank you so much to Chatham House, and it's an honor to be here. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yeah, it's an honor to have you here. And you mentioned the scientific community, amongst others. I think that's a good segue to hand over to Margaret for your opening remarks.
Good evening to those of you in London, and thanks to Chatham House for convening this important discussion, and special appreciation to Ambassador Valles for his leadership and for the delegates here who are working so hard. I'm speaking for the International Science Council, which federates 250 international scientific unions, associations, as well as national and regional scientific organizations, academies, and research councils. We've been at every INC meeting, contributing integrated scientific inputs and expert advice to delegates, despite the lack of a formal platform to date, and we're joined by so many other groups of scientists. When that resolution was voted on in 2022, over 195 nations agreed and directed that the process consider best available science, traditional knowledge, knowledge of indigenous peoples, and local knowledge systems, and identified the urgent need to strengthen the science policy interface at all levels. This call recognized the substantial evidence to date of the ubiquity and harms of plastic pollution and brought the ISC and other expert and knowledge groups to the negotiations. And since that time, the scientific consensus has grown on the detrimental impacts of plastic pollution on human health and the environment, which are documented in so many expert reports. And here are a few of the findings. The over 8 billion metric tons of plastic produced since 1950 are now choking the planet. The vast majority remains in the environment and in us. Between 1950 and 2002, global plastic production and consumption grew exponentially, and that continues. For example, 2.2 million metric tons in 1950, around 450 million metric tons projected. So with the most rapid increases in the production of single-use plastics that were used once still persist in the environment. So this growth is out of control to some extent, and it's making things worse. Current plastic production levels already far exceed sustainability thresholds, and without intervention, global plastic production is projected to almost triple by 2060. It's ubiquitous and persistent in the environment and visibly pollutes our ocean, beaches, rivers, and land in all parts of the world and harms wildlife and economies. Some populations, including the small island states, experience this burden disproportionately. Previously invisible aspects are now increasingly visible as knowledge has grown. We now know microplastics and the chemicals in plastics are found in remote environments, including air and water the world over, and in the bodies of land and sea animals, and we are not immune. Plastics also harm human health with disproportionate impacts on vulnerable populations, including workers, formal and informal, and children whose exposure to chemicals and plastics, including in the womb, can have devastating lifelong effects. Many, but not all of these impacts are associated with the chemicals incorporated into plastic products, which include known carcinogens, neurotoxicants, and endocrine disruptors. We're only beginning to understand the potential impacts of the presence of micro and nanoplastic particles in our bodies, so far found in blood, breast milk, brain, lung, heart, liver, placenta, and that list goes on. And throughout the negotiations, the scientific and health communities have been broadly aligned in our recommendations. First, health and environmental impacts associated with plastic pollution occur at every stage of the plastic life cycle, and systemic interventions across that life cycle are needed. Second, science-based criteria for elimination of problematic plastics and chemical components will be key to addressing health and environmental impacts, as will product design requirements that consider safety and sustainability. And third, and critically, addressing upstream plastic production is needed to protect health and the environment. This will require robust measures that reduce primary and problematic plastic production. To support evidence-based decision-making and effective responses, experts also agree the treaty must enable better, transparent, and traceable data, as well as robust reporting and monitoring across the life cycle. For example, the latest scientific assessments identified over 16,000 chemicals used or present in plastics and found 4,200 of these known to be hazardous. But for more than 2/3, hazard data are not publicly available, and where available, they're often incomplete. This hinders governments from taking action to effectively manage risks. These data, along with effective reporting of measures taken under the treaty to achieve its objective, will enable a robust assessment of progress over time and can inform the governing body, the COP's, future decisions. Once the Geneva negotiations conclude, it will be critical to establish clear pathways for the progressive development of the treaty, as the chairman noted, informed by the best available science and best knowledge of solutions. We already know many key areas where technical expertise and critical knowledge are needed. The chair's text, as well as a number of member proposals, and we hope more, will note the roles that subsidiary bodies could play in implementing and developing particular articles like Article 3 on plastic products. After the negotiations end, the process will also need technical expertise to develop the implementation guidance, the rules of the road, and sectoral programs of work needed for implementation. A well-designed, fit-for-purpose, and efficient science policy interface will play a key role in meeting the substantial need for scientific and technical inputs, objective scientific and technical inputs, into ongoing decision-making implementation. The best options for this mechanism can draw on lessons learned across existing science advisory mechanisms, and while much of this work can happen on the road to the first COP meeting, it will require the treaty text to provide the basis for it. Finding the landing zones during INC 5.2 will be challenging, but scientific evidence remains unchanged by negotiations and provides an objective foundation for sound decision-making now and the future. The scientific community, the INC, and all our colleagues are ready to support the critical opportunity before our delegates to demonstrate that multilateral cooperation can address the challenges of our time, like the plastic pollution crisis. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. That's great. Summarizing all of this in such a short time. As we know, the body of science literature on the impacts, the chemicals, etc., is growing day by day in a way. Nature just recently, over the weekend, published this new editorial also looking towards the importance of the treaty in addressing some of these issues. I think over to you, Dr. Sivendra Michael. I just wanted to mention, when I posted about the event on LinkedIn, there was one person who responded, I hope the treaty can address the issues that the most affected communities are facing. And I had to think about the Pacific, not only the great Pacific garbage patch, but also Pacific Island countries who are facing a lot of impacts from plastics. Please, over to you.
Thank you so much, moderator, and good morning, good evening, colleagues from joining from all over the world. Firstly, I would like to thank the organizers for convening this meeting at such a critical time, just weeks ahead, days ahead, in fact, of INC 5.2, which we all hope would be our last, set of negotiations, quite frankly, to bring this treaty to a close and also, ensure that it is one that fully reflects the ambition that it needs and has the principles and elements that benefit the whole world, not just PCs, not just LDCs, not just our Caribbean seeds, but one that really looks at in its entirety, the science and policy interface, the one that looks at particular elements of finance that we have been talking about. And as you rightfully mentioned, for Pacific Seeds, the custodians of the Blue Pacific, which is the world's largest oceanic lung, absorbing vast amounts of carbon, but also sustaining the world's largest or most richest global biodiversity. And yet, this discussion happening continuously, as you mentioned, fail to turn an eye on, some member countries do not understand the scale of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is twice the area of the size of Texas. So when PCs, despite being one of the most negligible contributors to this global plastic crisis, we do bear outsized burdens, particularly in our remote islands and where our landfills are designed in such a way that it's only located in the centrality of the main island. I give you an example here in Fiji. I am situated in the capital, which is Suva, and the landfill is about 45-50 minutes drive from where I am situated. But we do have 332 islands that make up Fiji, with only one landfill only being able to service 4 municipal councils and 2 rural authorities, which means that our outer islands have to deal with the whole plastic crisis on their own, which really collapsed their food systems. We know that this human health dimension that Miss Margaret has spoken about is one that many might still be challenging the sciences behind it, but it really affects our people. So for us, I think we are quite clear in how we think that this can have how Geneva can be really a landing zone on some of the critical areas. And I must thank wholeheartedly Ambassador for his leadership and for also ensuring that even the way we have these discussions, there are certain points of clarity that has been made throughout since INC1, since his leadership. He always ensured that we are not backtracking on some of these discussions that are very essential. One of which is very important, the special circumstances for SIDS and LDCs, so which must be at the core, and it has to be operational. This should not be just symbolic. The treaty must recognize resource and enforcement needs of SIDS and LDCs, and this should be focusing on translating equity into technology transfer, capacity building, and simplified access to finance. The reason why I say this is because a lot of times we've gotten SIDS and LDC's special circumstances recognized, but and Ambassador Safia will also talk about this. Its operationalization element is what's lacking. We don't have the teeth in the game, which means we need a robust and a predictable financial mechanism that should be able to help us in order to look at the remediation, look at all the incremental as well as the infrastructure cost. It's not only how the current lenses of climate finance or how biodiversity finance is currently designed, which looks at special types of cost, which really leaves the burden on national budgets to actually address this issue. And I think that for us, what does a robust financial resource look like? It needs to provide a clear provision on who undertakes the provision of finance. It needs to have the access to finance language that's really important, the alignment to other financial flows, because we need to ensure that the core instruments objectives are aligned to the financing needs, and more importantly, we need to have the review clause. We need to make it known that it is to be complementary, it has to be new and additional finance, and it's not the current ODA being spread across. Because I mean, this is a core discussion of this, when we have developed countries saying that the ODA will be spread thin and so forth. No, we are asking about new and additional finance. We need asking about highly concessional lending, things like this that need to look at, if we're looking at innovative sources of financing, something that works for us, not that something that's on paper that's not going to work for us. The third one, which Margaret has covered really properly, we must look at the full life cycle of the plastic, from design all the way to production to waste management. It must be a treaty that it is looking at the systems approach. Without upstream measures, we'll be stuck in cleaning garbage in perpetuity and now downstream. And lastly, I echo everything that Madam Margaret has mentioned in terms of science, and also the indigenous knowledge that must be a guide or guiding star for this. Yes, we do need a strong science policy interface that draws on global, regional, and knowledge and scientific knowledge, but indigenous expertise is also very critical and essential, especially in areas where their indigenous knowledge has actually done so much to ensure that our oceans and our ecosystems are thriving and being able to survive. I need to make this known. I think we do need to ensure that we are making decisions on independent and credible data and not on industry narratives. And this is something that's really important. So again, why does timing matter for us? Because INC 5.2, and yes, it's a coincidence, Ambassador, it's 5 to 14, it's 5:14. It is more than a negotiating session for us. It is a moment for us to really set clear, legally binding benchmarks before countries that return home. The language needs to be in the treaty. It's not shall, it's not maybe. It's what we must do, what binding caps, what phase out, what reuse targets we must ensure should be there. So for us, once again, we are ready to engage constructively. We've always been there to help and engage in a very constructive manner. Yes, there will be some hard compromises to make, but let's not make this a watered down treaty, one that will really affect the generations to come. Our people, our future deserves no less. And I think we are the generation that wants to celebrate that we have actually come so far to have a standalone plastics treaty, and we let Geneva mark the day when the words are anchored in accountability and not ambiguity. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Dr. Michael. I like also your call to action for high ambition at the end. Maybe directly over to Ambassador Sophia. Continue from here.
Thanks so much. And it's really difficult to follow PS Michael. Thank you so much for setting the stage on ambition. And again, just before I get into the discussion, because there's so much that I'd like to talk about, I really want to thank the organizers and the consideration for having two vocal SIDS lead on the panel. We're quite proud as small island developing states coming and representing different regions and different realities to be engaged in this level of discussion. I think one of the key things that I shared at UNOC in Nice is we show up. We constantly show up despite our capacity limitations, despite the many competing priorities that we have to manage and juggle within our governments, within our countries. We are actively participating in this process, and we're actively supporting this approach of healthy multilateralism. And so, as PS Michael has said, we know that going into Geneva that there will be some very hard compromises. But we've been very clear as small island developing states on some of the red lines that support our priorities and which have supported our priorities within the process of multilateral environmental agreements over the years. Certainly special circumstances of SIDS. Again, I would like to echo just how important it is that it's enshrined within this new treaty, not in a symbolic way, but in a way that considers the current difficulties and struggles that we have, particularly around operationalizes the approaches that are typically given to us for consideration when we have to implement obligations of any treaty. We often say, and then this also goes back to the point that PS made on traditional and local knowledge. Most of the times, this is not considered as part of the implementation approaches, particularly when you have donors that are pretty insistent on a certain approach that typically on the ground is not working. And so I think part of why we rally together as a collective of 39 plus small island developing states is to let the world know that these current, particularly for past multilateral environmental agreements, that we are struggling with some elements of implementation. And as we negotiate new agreements, we would like to account for those struggles as part of the defining text of any new and emerging agreement. And so I'd like to maybe focus my opening remarks around three areas. The first is around the process. The second would be on the remediation article. And the third would also look at finance and the role that small island developing states have played in trying to structure the finance article and consider it as part of a package, as Ambassador Valles has referenced earlier. So on the process, I do agree that the recently held and convened heads of delegation meeting, which many of the committee members called for, and really happy that the Secretariat was able to deliver an in-person session, allowed us to get a sense of where the convergences still are coming out of Busan, but also how we can make progress on some of the more difficult and challenging elements of the text. I do want to agree with PS and many that have spoken to the chair's leadership on allowing us to work with a text that everyone has agreed to use as the basis for this last negotiation session in Geneva. And so we're really extremely happy at the work of the chair and his team to get us to a place that we can actually negotiate on substance. And so in terms of the process, the HODs, as the ambassador said, provided this barometer, but also providing us maybe outside of a very formal setting to really consider some avenues to progress on some of the more challenging and difficult elements. And so coming out of the session, as the chair and PS has said, we've had some text proposals that considers some convergences. We also have some consideration of approaches that can be taken in terms of the organization of work when we get into the resumed session in Geneva. And so for me, that is a very positive way forward, positive motion forward. And it does consider some of the elements of progress that we have made in Busan. The key thing about Busan is that we've also learned what works and what actually doesn't work in terms of how we approach the work. And so that was really useful that we can consider those elements at the in-person heads of delegation meeting. So in terms of the process, we're quite excited as small island developing states to start off the negotiation with Busan on a very positive note, on a very progressive note, and as the ambassador said, on a very effective note. I don't think that we are prepared to be stuck in the circularity of negotiations that don't take us anywhere. As PS has said, we're very much coming into the process of Geneva with ambition, but ambition that has been scaled back in the interest of compromise and in the interest of delivering on the objective of 514, considering these elements that have been brought into the negotiation for consideration that many of our countries agreed to within UNEA. So we are delivering on, as the ambassador said, a movement that has been started by civil society, that has been moved by the science and the concern of people and planet. So we're very much in that spirit when we get to Geneva, and we'll continue to work with the chair and many of the heads of the other regional groups to ensure that we are aligned on organization of work. In terms of remediation, as many of you would know, this is one of the critical calls from small island developing states. We are very happy to be giving a space and a platform to hold a set of informal dialogues on how we can structure an article on remediation that considers our special circumstances and considers our vulnerability. As PS has so critically pointed out, even at the national level, there's so many considerations that we need to make that many other countries don't, particularly when you have countries like Fiji that have remote populations, and thinking of the logistics of how you enforce policy, how you enforce implementation on several different islands that considers remote circumstances. So these are the issues, and it does become very resource intensive, and we understand that this is not something that we can do alone. So part of the call by small island developing states within the remediation article is to support a form of a mechanism that is grounded in collective cooperation, that considers other coordination mechanisms that we have utilized at the regional and sub-regional level, as well as the international level, but creates a space utilizing this treaty that allows for the focus to be placed on building a platform that helps to deliver for small islands. And so this is one of the key features that we've been negotiating with colleagues, and we're very much looking forward to continuing those negotiations in Geneva. Another key part of the remediation article, of course, again, is enshrining special circumstances, but also linking it to financing, because we can spend a lot of time crafting and designing these mechanisms, but without having the resources, the reliability of the resources, unfortunately, we're not able to implement. And so linking the remediation, as PS would have said, to a fund established under the mechanism within the Article 11 is really important. And so finally, on Article 11, as small island developing states, we're very happy that we have continued the work with the African group, as well as the group of Latin American states, on aligning on key elements that will define the structure of the finance mechanism, but also allows us to be very creative in the way that we consider lessons from other conventions, as PS would have referenced, but also consider what this mechanism is trying to do. And we have an opportunity here where we can leverage the industry. There is a lot of interest by the industry to be given the right signals. And I think this is part of where we start crafting within this emerging treaty the right signals to the industry. This is a great opportunity for us to really be creative when crafting this financing mechanism and really consider this idea of sustainability in financing approaches. How are we able to create a mechanism that is nimble and agile enough that will consider the role of private sector, that will consider the role of concessional and grant financing to those that are most vulnerable, but also understand how that financing can be used to de-risk and blend to allow for leveraging from multiple sources. So we're very much encouraged and looking forward to continuing this technical work in Geneva, and I'm happy to talk more about it when we get into the discussion element of this. But thanks again for the opportunity to offer these opening remarks.
Yes, thank you very much, Ambassador Sophia. That's great. There's quite a great level of detail already on the different articles that need to be addressed, and I'm glad you mentioned the industry, and that's a good segue over to Jez. Thanks for joining. And you also mentioned circularity of negotiations. Obviously, we don't want to see more of that, but circularity of plastics is your bread and butter, and that's also one of the future areas for the industry.
Yeah, it was almost like we planned it, so thank you for that, Ambassador, just leading into it. So, firstly, thank you for having me here. I certainly find it very difficult to follow the people that have just spoken because they know the process in depth and are working through all the challenges associated with it. But I work for a company called Amcor, which is a company that by design probably not many people in the room have heard of because we're a business-to-business business, and we make packaging for many global brands around the world, and we have the dubious honour of being the largest packaging company in the world, of which a very significant volume of that packaging is plastic. So there's a very real issue associated with this, and we're as passionate as a business internally about resolving these issues as the countries that have already spoken. So with the two hats I've got on, I'm also here representing the Business Coalition, just to expand that view a bit further. And the Business Coalition is effectively a group of a very large number of global companies that use plastics in their everyday business, whether it be for packaging or automotive sector or lots of different things. And some might say that some sort of global regulation, multilateral agreement, would in some way hinder our work rather than support it. But it's quite the reverse. And I look at it very much that we've got a very large group of companies that have all come together with a common view. And that obviously doesn't happen very often with lots of big multinational corporations. And that common view is what I can only describe as a high ambition coalition view, in the fact that we want as high an ambition treaty as possible, because wherever we operate in whatever country, it's a global market, and trying to do things right in individual countries is very difficult because there's always someone who is willing to break the rules and undercut and do things that aren't best in class in those areas. So if you look at countries which are perceived as dealing with plastic issues well, developed nations, Europe, UK, if we use the UK as an example, as that's where we're currently sitting in Chatham House now, what have we got in the UK? We've got strong regulations, we've got strong product design rules, we've got strong rules on chemicals of concern and what is allowed in products. We have robust financing mechanisms on day-to-day products through mechanisms like extended producer responsibility schemes. And whilst far from perfect, and there's still issues that need to be resolved in those developed countries, most of the visible effects of leakage, of environmental leakage in these individual countries are well on the way to being solved. So this mechanism spreads that view globally, and so really supportive of everything that's in here, and we can only do what we can do to try and get behind saying that yes, industry doesn't see this as a threat, we see this as a mechanism to balance the rules and actually unlock investment, because that's key. So in the UK, just going back to this example, as an industry, our company, my company, Amcor, we produce a very large amount of packaging made from polypropylene. So this is things like, personal care products and butter tubs and all sorts of things like this. And our separate department to packaging is actually our recycling division. And in the UK, we've built the infrastructure in the UK to take 50,000 tonnes of that, which is about half of all the UK's polypropylene packaging, and we physically bring it back into our own facilities, reprocess it and put it back into our own products. And I think that is what robust rules unlocks. It unlocks that level of investment to allow companies to actually put that infrastructure in to deal with it within the territories where it's actually developed, where it's actually produced. Now, I love hearing about the challenges from the small island developing states, because I'm sitting in a much bigger country, and I'm also aware that these rules have to be nuanced for those specific situations. We can't understand, you can't just pick up a model that sits in a big country and say it's going to work in Grenada. So the wording needs to be such that it's flexible enough to work in those situations, but no less opportunity to actually put in the same mechanisms through groups of countries. It's great that this has really focused the point where countries have come together to show that we can work together globally to solve this problem. So I don't want to labour the point too much, because there's a lot of people who actually know good things in this room. But I'm more here to say that from an industry point of view, there is nothing that we're fighting against here. We've sit absolutely behind the chair and the negotiators to say we'll carry on supporting on the ground in Geneva, the same as on the ground in Busan and other ones, to provide as much support, whether it be moral support or cups of coffee to keep the negotiating team awake, whatever it takes. We're there to push that through. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Jazz. No, this is a really good message, actually. I think you also explained very well. With the global rules will then have impact on also national legislation, and that, let's say, regulatory certainty will then also unlock the investments to address the issues on the ground. And that's then also where corporate investments, etc., can make a huge difference. So, yeah, thank you. Now, we have a few minutes left we have more time left for questions, so start thinking about questions that you would like to ask. But there was one question that's come up, actually it's come also up in the chat. It's a question about the United States. And it's a topic here at Chatham House that comes up actually all the time for many reasons. But so we know the United States under the Trump administration pulled out of Paris. They're not necessarily champions of environmental issues or not even champions of multilateral cooperation. So what is now the situation with the United States in the treaty negotiations? And I wanted to ask Margaret first, being based in the UK and working on US policy. Can you give us some insights, what we might be able to expect when we come to Geneva?
Well, I would be saying something as a U.S. citizen, not as a representative of the International Science Council, but to say, and as a former member of government here in the United States, that, in these processes, the United States has been present and active from day one. In fact, after our bipartisan report was issued, was called for by Congress when I was at the National Academies of Sciences, it was just after that the U.S. joined the resolution. So they're attentive to science generally. Now, this administration has not been open yet about their position. Perhaps at the HODS meeting, they were more. Normally, they would, in this process, have a discussion with stakeholders before the meeting. To my knowledge, that hasn't occurred yet. In general, the United States is we did a report also that showed that there are a number of authorities in existence in law now that would enable action, and the previous administration did start a process for identifying how they could take action, and that influenced the position at the last meeting. Now, we are really looking forward to hearing, especially what the U.S. position would be. I'm hopeful that they will want to be productive, and but I can't say anything more than that. It's very important that they continue to support science, which is a concern, of course, and the funding for science is also a concern, and a very active discussion right now in the United States. And I'm interested also to hear their position on chemicals and microplastics, which seem to have been raised, at least from some quarters of the United States. I also see that Congress is still interested. It's a very active time right now on Capitol Hill, but I would say that they're important, and yet I also think that the number of countries that are moving for ambition is substantial, and the public opinion on this is very strong. So these are all observations rather than predictions. I hope that's helpful to start us off. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. No, some very good insights, and also again good to hear that actually the public perception of the issue or public support for action on plastics is still strong. Ambassador Sophia or Dr. Michael, was there anything you wanted to add?
I think, and I think Ambassador in his leadership has also always, echoed these sentiments that we are in a time and space where, yes, we've seen that the US has reversed, some of the discussions or retracted some of the discussions on binding caps for plastic production. In the informal hordes, we heard that they were not a viable option or preferred market-led, country-level approach kind of discussion was the kind of language that I was getting. I'm just opening my notes on some of the things that I had heard. They were also, reflecting industry concerns around the American Chemistry Council that warned that caps could threaten the U.S. manufacturing. But I also think that, despite this sort of language having not despite knowing that this such a set of language has severe implications on the treaty, it can weaken the treaty's backbone. It can bring about geopolitical instability. But I think what's really important at the heart of it is we know that there is a future that prolongs beyond this administration, and that always we've seen it in the Paris Agreement where US had left and then US had joined, right? We should be thinking about that future where US will come back, to join and try and reignite these discussions on support for upstream measures, on support for a global framework that risks the fragmentation into national level patchwork solutions. I think these are things that we insist that that it should still be there, whether or not the current administration recognizes that. I think we need to go past that, beyond that, because leadership will change. We have genuine people in this treaty negotiation process that see eye to eye on matters that really needs to be at the heart of the treaty. I'll stop there, but I feel like US being a major plastic producer and a key global actor, you need to show that leadership, and this is can be something that can come regardless of the US political ties, if I can be diplomatically sound in saying that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Michael. And actually, yeah, clear message to take a long view rather than a more short-term, because addressing plastics pollution is a long-term challenge that we need to address over decades, not just years.
Yeah.
Ambassador, do you have anything to add?
I just wanted to echo the comments made by my colleague, P.S. Michael. And also to say that, again, just utilizing the gathering in Nairobi, just our experience with the U.S. there's, and this is at the negotiator and technical level, that they're still very much involved in these technical discussions, particularly around how we move difficult and challenging items forward. So that's really good. That's really good that they're still part of these conversations. So certainly at the technical level, I think that there are some considerations that they're bringing in that's allowing us, particularly around finance, to consider as we work on crafting this finance article. And I guess the other point is on the role of industry. I think the clear message that we also got from the US is that this treaty really needs to send the right signals to industry, and they're very much on board in supporting that type of language being captured. So those for me, in addition to what P.S. Michael has raised, are some of the key takeaways from HOTS.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Ambassador. And there's another segue again with industry over to Jazz. I think because you have also US customers, they're part of your supply chain.
Absolutely. The US is obviously a question that comes up quite a lot, but we've got a lot of very US-centric businesses that are involved in the coalition. But I think generally the impression that we're getting from, let's say, the US negotiating team is positive, that they want a treaty done. Right? That they're coming with a view that actually they want to get a resolution. Yes, there are problematic areas, which are problematic areas to any country that produces a lot from petrochem revenue. So yes, there are some challenging issues for dealing with those, but overwhelmingly it's a case of, if you look at the high level issue, generally in my huge experience of multilateral negotiations, that the fundamental issue of the people that I've spoken to is the fact that nobody is denying the fact there's a global plastics pollution problem that needs to be resolved, and it would be a brave country to say, oh, actually, yes, we're quite happy to just keep chucking plastic in the ocean and letting it leak into the environment. So I think that fundamental issue, for me, pervades throughout all those other conversations. Yeah, there's nuance in exactly how it works, but I think generally, even some of the countries that would sit sort of left field, would be quite, have been problematic, should we say, going through this process, they still want the same aims. They're still at the table and they're still trying to negotiate. And I think the chair is doing a great job actually marshalling those resources to keep them engaged to get to an agreement. So I feel it's positive. I've had positive sort of views from some people who've spoken in there, so I'm optimistic. Remain optimistic.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, that's encouraging to hear. Ambassador Weiss, do you want to add anything?
Well, not much, but thank you very much. Sometimes people, I'm from Ecuador, and as you mentioned, I'm the ambassador of Ecuador here in London. Sometimes people ask me, so how is the Ecuadorian position? I say, well, you have to ask the Ecuadorian negotiators, because I'm the chair for all the countries. I'm the chair of the process that includes all the members from the UN. But what I have seen, and it has been mentioned now by our colleagues in the panel, we have seen a delegation that it has been quite active, I would say constructive. Yes, it was until Busan with the previous administration, but I have the faith, and I'm optimist that we will see, we will keep seeing a US like that. I have followed some events also in the US. I have seen also declarations from Secretary Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, for instance, and so that gives me the optimism, like in the same line, that we could see effective treaty by the end of Geneva.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, so that's good news. Great. Before we go into the Q&A, there's one more question. So, but get your questions ready, and then we can have that. there's not only the US, but there's also other countries and other country groupings. So, for example, there's the BRICS, the High Ambition Coalition was already mentioned. There's also the like-minded group of countries. I wanted to ask Dr. Michael and Ambassador Sophia, with the position of the SIDS and also some of the topics that you talked about, how can you find agreement with those other country blocks? So where there are already common issues, but where there might be still divergences, how can that be overcome? And also there's questions around what might be the right sequence to address some of these issues that we then, at the end of the Geneva negotiations, come to this agreement.
I guess I'll just go ahead and take this question first, if that's okay, PS. I mean, I think it's a really great question, and I think this is part of the strategy that we have to consider as SIDS. How do we approach these groups? So I guess a couple of things. Again, going back to HOS, I think HOS was really instrumental to get a sense of what some of the key regional positions were. So coming in as small island developing states, we were very clear that particularly for the Geneva process, we wanted to ensure that we had collective positions across most of the articles that we've been discussing. So prior negotiation sessions, particularly for the groups that at least Grenada negotiates, and we negotiate as part of AOSIS, but also as part of the group of Latin American states, we wanted to ensure that there was convergence within the positions that we have, where positions will consider key priorities of small and developing states within GRULAC. And the same for SIDS. If there are key proposals that GRULAC is supporting, we wanted to ensure, at least at the technical level, that we are aligned before we take a converged position to a wider group. So I think that sort of workshopping helps. But as we get closer to Geneva, there is a role for some of these regional groups, the like-minded, BRICS, HAC, and so on, for us to continue the technical negotiations at the level of these groups, with the understanding that when we started off this process, there was a sense of what ambition could look like, of course, guided by 514, but understanding as we approach the end of this process that there are certain compromises that we have to make, and we don't particularly need to make those compromises in silos. So we know that there are key obligations that are linked within the treaty. There are some challenging articles that we have considered, at least at the technical level, how we could align those articles as part of a package in terms of strategy for negotiations, particularly as we start with exchanges at the group level. So these are considerations that we are making as part of the strategy approach between now and Geneva, particularly continuing the work intersessionally at the group level, not at the individual country level, so that we understand where the nuances are, where are some opportunities to move items further, and then where are the opportunities where we have to compromise on some key elements that would allow for us to still keep ambition, still keep to the mandate of 514 on some elements. So yeah, it's a very tricky dance, but I think we have set ourselves up based on the leadership of the chair to have this framing under which we can advance some of these conversations at the technical level, so that politically, particularly for Geneva, where our ministers are going to be playing a role and have a presence, that we're able to give the right political signals to those ministers and high-level representatives that will also be engaging in the process.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yeah, no, I think what you're saying, working on the technical details can then often unlock also some of the political issues that are there. But yeah, Dr. Michael, do you want to add to that?
I think yes, Ambassador is really put it out there on how we can actually bridge the divide and move forward. But I think also and I also think that, how at the HODs we had an opportunity to engage on those discussions. I think one of the things that Ambassador had mentioned in the earlier part of our intervention around, not wanting to be stuck in circular discussions. And, for us in the Pacific, we've always said that the procedural niceties is one way that they, always deviate from the very critical discussions that need to happen. And what the HODS meeting had really, and through, thank you again, Ambassador, for your leadership, like what did the HODS meeting really achieve is we made it very clear that countries are not going to come here and restate their positions, because we know everyone's position. We don't have to come and, romanticize about each other's positions and what we need. We need to find the middle ground. And the middle ground means we need to compromise, and compromise in a way that does not put one country, or one country's right to develop sustainably, and the other country having to choose between economic progress and environmental integrity. This was very, very, very properly laid out to us that, we already know. We have met like more than 5 times now, and we've met in many small groups. And I think what's very important for us right now, which Ambassador has mentioned, is what do we do from now and the 18 days till we get to 20 days till we get to the start of this next process, right? And a lot of them have been showing up, which is what Ambassador said, to these discussions to try and see how do we find a middle ground, right? The fact that you're showing up and being part of that conversations means that you do want to be part of the conversation to reach at least a landing zone. And we are seeing that they are coming, say for example, Article 12, the IOCs was there to listen to Brazil's proposal to try and see how we can listen and how we can come to and asking each other the right questions, like how does it work in the context of the Pacific? How would it be one opportunity that this is not repeated like every other treaty that does not have this mechanism? Like what would it look like? How would we ensure that it is backed up by resources to support the implementation? And I think this concrete proposal development, which needs to be officially tabled or bought in the process of INC 5.2, is already work in progress. And I think for those of us that have been proactively pushing for these convenings, this informal Ambassador, that we try to have these discussions ahead of INC 5.2, so that when we start, again, we don't have to have circular discussions. We don't have to be stuck in the procedural niceties. We need to move forward because we don't have much time.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry,
There's a
Patrick,
sense of urgency, definitely, yeah.
Sorry, can I just make one point on there? Just going back to a really key point that I think Ambassador Sophia made early on in that conversation, that some of this is in the detail, not just in the high level, because the issue of plastics, I take my hat off to everybody involved in this delegation and involved in the negotiation, because I've been around the world of waste management, recycling, plastic, packaging, and it's an incredibly complicated and diverse subject. And then if you add into that all of the scientific sides between the detailed analytical chemistry and the biological interactions with that side of it, some of the answers are in the nuance and are in the technical detail. And there's some of the countries that we're involved in, we've spoken to some of the negotiating teams in those countries, and there's just a general misunderstanding of what some of the wording is in relation to, in terms of what this is. Now, fortunately, that's one place where we've been able to support in some little way to try and unlock that understanding. But I don't think we should just underestimate, the learning curve that these people have been on over the last 3 or 4 years. It has been enormous. So thank you for that as well.
Yeah, I mean, learning curve for the whole of society, because everybody's learning about plastics, I think, on a constant basis, even if you're not necessarily following the treaty. So it's a big topic.
The plastics is the multilateralism I struggle with.
Okay, right, this is where they come together. Okay, over to you now. Yeah, please state your name and your organization and your question. And there's a microphone that will come around. And then let's take 3 questions first. Maybe for you, and then gentleman over there, the hand up here. And then we go to the other side after that.
My name is Prashani Dharmadasa. I'm a Chatham House member, and thank you to the panel. It was very interesting. My question, I think Ambassador Sophia actually alluded to this, but I will ask it anyway. So before attending this session, I actually came across an article led by University of South California, where they have found that 90% of Paris Agreement signatories exclude plastics from their NDCs, leaving a massive critical gap. So I also recognized in the treaty draft that the emissions side of it is also mentioned in there, and also references and instruments like the Rio Declaration, and these other instruments actually acknowledges the complementarity with existing frameworks. Now, my question is, I'm not suggesting revision or merger, but rather asking the question, given the emissions-related provisions that are already in the Plastics Treaty, are there any plans to take active steps or find pathways for inter-treaty integration? For example, the opportunity to align with the Paris Agreement NDCs to avoid silos and reinforce the inter-treaty compliance.
Okay, great, thank you. Right, we go to the next question first. So the link between climate and plastics and the treaties there. Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Jayhan Baban. I am an environmental scientist and renewable energy engineer. So I am originally from UCL as a senior chemist as well. I lead now, after retirement, I lead the Iraqi Environment and Health Society UK, which is NGO, voluntary. My question today, of course, we are tackling every type of pollutions, including the plastic pollution. And I publish many articles on that. My question is, how much support such international treaty will generate political will and adequate funding, particularly in deploying new technologies, such as by using AI machine learning and a neural network to predict and model microplastics pollution, and advise the design makers on how to control and manage such a problem. My second question, for the framework which you are presenting for that international treaty, is there any inclusiveness, which is the word, I'm sure you know what inclusiveness, which we have to use to implement as fairness for countries, because we're all different, so we need to agree about everything. Thank you very much.
Okay, great, thank you. And then over.
Thank you. Al Gill, I'm the co-lead of the Global Atmospheric Plastics Survey. I have a practical question, probably mostly for the ambassadors. How long does it take for the science to get from the scientists to the negotiators? And the reason I ask is, having listened to all the speakers, most people are talking about oceans rather than atmospheric plastics. Most people are talking about health rather than the global warming impact of plastics. Most people are always saying micro rather than micro and nano plastics as well.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. I think we've got questions for everyone. Some science, some more on the process, the interlinkages between the treaties. Ambassador Weiss, did you want to start with any of these?
Yeah, well, I could take a bit of each of the questions, but thank you so much. Very, very interesting questions. Maybe I could start with the last one. How long time it has? Too long. I think the answer is too long. As I mentioned before, All this starts with the NGOs, with the foundations, with the scientific community telling members that we need this international legally binding instrument. And yes, it took too long, but science is there. We need the scientific community. We need Margaret and the scientific and community all around the world to help us now in the negotiations and later on with the implementations. And as I mentioned, also in this interim period between Geneva and the diplomatic conference, and once we have the diplomatic conference until we have the first COP, the first conference of the parties. We do have enough, I think, scientific evidence, data. We will get more and more with the years to come. Like you have mentioned, Patrick, before, since we adopted resolution in March 2022, a lot of scientific evidence has come, a lot of information how we are destroying the environment and also our health, human health, how it's being destroyed because of plastic pollution. So we do have the scientific evidence to negotiate an effective treaty. And then I jump into the question about, I think it was a very important question, the relation between climate change and plastic pollution, well, quite related. What we have to consider is that we are negotiating here a legally binding instrument. We do have the triple crisis, climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, where plastic pollution is the main one. And all of them are related. But here we are negotiating a legally binding instrument. It's a big difference than what we have, for instance, in climate change. So we need to consider that, and that's also quite important. We are negotiating, and we are creating a new legislation, international law, that has to be implemented once we adopt this in our countries when we ratify the convention. So we need to take into account that, and also the importance, and it is in the text I have presented, the relation and the complementarity, like it has been mentioned, with other MEAs, with other environmental multilateral agreements, that it is important to have the relation. And it has to be also taken into account and considered in our negotiations. And also, of course, what it has been mentioned about, and this something that it was mentioned before too, I don't remember, it was from some of the panelists, that we need to consider the differences between countries. One thing is a developed country, a developing country, and also among developed countries and developing countries, the needs of the seeds of the small island developing states. When I have been, in islands. We have the Galapagos Islands in Ecuador, for instance, where we see how it is being affected by microplastics, by nanoplastics in the ocean into the island. So we need to consider all the differences. Not all the countries, like it was mentioned, are equal. We have different realities, and it has to be considered also those different realities when we have this treaty. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Margaret, I was wondering if you wanted to add to the science-related questions.
Yes, thank you for that question about the science. We certainly, everyone from the scientific community, flocked to the first INC to offer the best science that we could. And there was no formal process. The 2-year timeline has been very challenging. However, we did what we could, information sheets. We had, there were side events where there were briefings. This question of the connection to climate change has definitely been public. I think people are always at a different level of understanding of how big and important this problem is. In fact, there have been a couple of reports just recently on the linkages between climate change and plastic production. And, this is a threat multiplier. Certainly we acknowledge that in all of our reports. So I would say, and in particular, I've hosted multiple webinars for the National Academy of Sciences on microplastics and nanoplastics. So yes, it's there, and more communication is always useful. And the delegates, though, are moving very fast to absorb. I commend the delegates for absorbing as much as they could in this 2-year period. And I think that that's the importance of the provisions in the treaty, and that should be strengthened, if they can be, to create these ongoing scientific and technical bodies, subsidiary bodies, science policy interface, because one thing I will say is that the science is moving fast and it's becoming very, very robust. And we do have enough to act. So all of that is true. Macroplastics, nanoplastics, microplastics. What we don't want to do is have people say we don't have enough, because I think there's nothing I've seen in the literature that suggests that we, to our panelist's point, we want to continue this path. We're already way down in a bad place. So having said that, there are lots of ways to use innovative technologies, whether it's AI or others. Some of the modeling is using that already. We have many models that are trying to model what's happening. New models will be coming in to build the climate emissions into this. So I think if we can find a structure to deliver this information for the decision making going forward, and approach it from a start and strengthen approach, and don't leave anything out in the system. Everyone is going to be, the negotiators will negotiate their way through this, but if you don't address the drivers and include that in the information that's being sent to decision makers, we are not addressing the problem or meeting the ambition of 514. So I would say that you've opened the door for a very strong discussion of how scientists can be helpful. There are recommendations around how to deal with this in we have multiple treaties that address waste, that address pollution of sorts, and air pollution even, but we don't really have a way of connecting the dots, and that, I think, is the complementarity that is being discussed. And we would want to take our lessons on science advice from what worked and what didn't work in previous multilateral treaties. So there's a lot of discussion ahead, and I hope that there will be a very robust discussion about how to incorporate that. And we are concerned in particular about the microplastics and air pollution, the PM 2.5. We're very aware of that, but getting at this treaty structure is so important, and that the framework be a strong one that's ambitious and enables decisions to be made on information as it comes in, new information. But it's an incredibly important topic. Thank you.
Ambassador Sophia, Dr. Michael, I was wondering, did you want to come in on the question of inclusivity? Maybe if you want, just or any of the other points.
I would actually like to just add to what Margaret has been saying on the science, and just to kind of commend some of the really, really wonderful points that she's brought up. So as we know, science was what allowed us to even initiate this process. And as part of developing this process, the negotiators do consider the role of science, and really thankful to the NGO community for always showing up. It's not just the negotiators that are showing up and staying into the night, but the NGO community and the observer groups have been phenomenal in not just providing us with information packets, but considering how we can build some of these ideas in a creative way within the text without being too overly prescriptive, but just really laying the platform and the foundation for the institutions that can be developed under the treaty that will consider the role of science. Now, it's a very tricky topic for many of us that have been involved in negotiations of other multilateral environmental agreements, particularly the chemicals ones. We know that when it comes to the consideration of science and the inclusivity in the consideration of science, it can be challenging on what constitutes science and how we build in science into the process. If I do recall at the very beginning of the session, some of the proposals that were submitted for consideration when we were trying to build up the text of the agreement spoke to having a similar process like the IPCC within the climate agreement, where you have this separate body that focuses exclusively on bringing the science into the considerations of the decisions that are made at the COP, which is extremely important. But we also see how having a separate process not aligned to the timeline of the COP can also work against implementation. So those are some of the lessons learned that Margaret is referencing that we have to consider in some of these institutions that we build under the treaty that will support the effective inclusion of science within the decision-making and policy guidance to many of our countries. The idea of micro and nanoplastics has always been considered during this process, and how that is treated. Of course, we need to have a technical body in place to really understand what the ramifications are and how, as countries, we can consider that within our national plan and implementation plan and design. But particularly for the Pacific Islands, and I'm sure my colleague P.S. Michael will talk about how this rapidly evolving concern on how microplastics can negatively impact the economies and industries of the small island developing states within the Pacific is a great and grave concern. So it does underpin a lot of the discussions that we're having and a lot of the positions as small island developing states that we have considered and really pushed forward on in this process. In terms of technology transfer and how that is, or just technology and how that is considered as part of the agreement, of course, there's an article that looks at technology transfer and how we can formalize that within this process to allow developing countries and normal countries to have access without it being a burden or a cost to them. So these negotiations are ongoing. There's been proposals. One comes to mind, I think we've referenced it before, where Brazil has looked at how we've traditionally dealt with cooperation and complementarity of other frameworks and agreements, and consider why don't we just be creative in this process and think of establishing a separate cooperation mechanism. So these are things that that's currently being proposed, and this is in direct reaction to other processes, but also the need to ensure that we do not work in a vacuum. This treaty is not in a vacuum. It's going to look at trade treaties, it's going to look at the role of chemical treaties, and other frameworks that have been supported within UNEA and within the UN and just the multilateral environmental agreement process. It's a lot of these considerations. So I'll just end here.
Thank you very much. We're coming close to the end, but we did want to have another round of questions. We could run over there, and there's still more questions on this side, and then right next to you, and then lady in the red jacket.
Hi, thanks to all the speakers so far. My name is Nick Hopkinson. I'm a professor of respiratory medicine at Imperial College and chair of action on smoking and health. So trillions of cigarette butts are discarded into the environment every year. They're the most common microplastic found in the sea. And the scientific consensus is very clear that they provide no protection at all to people who smoke, and that they're a sort of fraudulent item that convinces people that smoking is less harmful than it is and prompts people to start and to continue. Now, most states in the world are signatories of the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. Is there a prospect that one relatively low-hanging fruit for a plastics treaty will be a ban on this particularly egregious, useless form of single-use plastic?
Thank you. Yeah, over to you.
Yeah. I work at the BSI, British Standard Institution. We represent the UK's interests, so we work at the ISO International Standardization Organization level, representing the UK's interest. And my question is, I was pleased to hear about the reporting and monitoring issue, and I wonder the level of discussion that you're having in the monitoring and measurement requirement, and whether that will be more discussed after the ratification from each country.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Terry Slave, and I'm the editor of Ethical Corporation magazine. I've got a couple of questions, but I'll stick to one, and that's about the role of plastic credits, market-based, in this treaty. Are these a solution? Are these, or are they not? They're very controversial.
Yes, good questions. I'll throw in one question from the audience, which is very UK-specific. Question is, when will the UK have its deposit return scheme? Maybe that's a for you. So I suggest we do a round, and you can answer the questions and then any other statement that you want to bring in to wrap up. So we might go over time a bit. Feel free if you need to leave, but maybe another 5-6 minutes, etc.
I'll take the easy one, 2027.
Yeah. For the return scheme?
That's the plan.
That's the plan,
yeah.
Okay. Actually, maybe Dr. Michael, maybe over to you.
Thanks. I'll take ISO and the cigarette bud issue. I think in terms of the discussions on the monitoring, reporting, and measurement, monitoring, and measurement, of course, there is. Negotiations. This is very contentious and unresolved at the moment. We do have specific articles that are talking to the effectiveness of the global plastics treaty and ensuring that the MRV, which is often grouped in under one article, and how that can be incorporated, accordingly. So for us, we have always, made it known between the risk of this becoming a voluntary set of aspirations rather than a legally binding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ambassador Safia, that we always have a discussion around how that can be referenced. So currently, how it is in the text, maybe as in the latest version of the chair's draft, which is our basis of negotiation, is there is an article on national action plan, because countries do have to take responsibility to report on the progress, and which is still under negotiation. There is also an article on implementation and compliance, which is really important, which proposes the mechanism to assess how the countries will meet their obligations. But it's the structure, whether it's facilitative or punitive, or however you want to put it, that still needs to be discussed and fleshed out. And we also believe that the COP process in the future would also add a lending voice on compliance, just like the Paris Agreement and any other multilateral environmental agreement. The ambit under which the article on implementation and compliance, it sets a direction on how we would like to take things forward. One particular thing that I really am so proud that we have actually discussed this is the article on financial distribution, because everyone asks us about the effectiveness of the money or the funds that reach us or reach the recipient countries, and having that language is very important for not only for transparency and accountability, but also to track how financial resources are moved from the contributors to those that are receiving the funds, and how they're using it to look at the full life cycle of plastics. There are some political fault lines on this, where, again, I say we, as high ambition countries or as specific seeds, we want very strong legally binding MRV provisions with public reporting, with independent oversight. But again, one of the strongest arguments and pushbacks that we are hearing is that the private sector is not, party to the treaty. It's the member states that are party to the treaty. So how do we circumvent that discussion and go into the very discussion that our colleagues from the business coalition have actually mentioned, that they want to be part of the solution, and welcoming that independent oversight, but also giving them a platform to understand the provisions on public reporting, which does not only put the burden on member states, but needs the collaboration of the private sector. So I'll stop there on the ISO part. But in terms of the cigarette butt, important point, and the same can be argued by all the treaty conventions on UNCLOS. There is many other other multilateral environmental agreements that look at specific types of products that are very harmful, such as plastic straws and so forth. So for us, what we are saying is, yes, it's a low-hanging fruit, and it can be incorporated in the initial list of problematic plastics, and this is something that is still up for discussion. What we are seeing is that there is no, how I can say, there is no agreement that there shouldn't be any list, right? There is a general consensus that we should have a starting point of what are the problematic plastics that needs to be referenced and so forth in Article 3 and so forth. So for us, it's very important that this discussion continues, and there is a further understanding on how we can bring and recognize what other MEAs are currently, addressing, and how that can be naturally accommodated in this treaty that we're trying to push for, to have it recognized in a way that we wouldn't say low-hanging fruit, but one that actually encompasses the entirety of many problematic plastics that are really affecting our marine and as well as our land health and our public health of our people as well. Just in terms of the role of plastics credits, this is something others can touch on. I think we had actually made it very clear that the innovative sources of financing must be something that works for us. So you can have things on the paper and things that might work in the global north, but that may not be so contextually relevant or applicable to the region. So I think this is something about going to the nuances and the technical niceties of what we want and what we do not want, and how we can have a middle ground. So we would have to observe, at least in the treaty text, some level of flexibility in including language that encompasses the whole innovative thinking of financing, but also recognizing that for PCIDs, there is this very clear narrative that it should be grant-based financing and highly concessional loans, because for us, the things like blended financing currently are not very practical and have not demonstrated much success. So we must really ensure that it's, as Ambassador said, is that it's not one-size-fits-all approach. It's the one that is really discussed at depth, and how its applicability is appropriated at the country level is very important. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to bring this into perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very
Can
much.
Can I add one thing, Patrick?
Yes.
The question on
briefly.
monitoring and data. First of all, the gentleman's question about cigarette butts. Certainly, advocates are at the treaty arguing for that. Right now, the discussion is probably best in Article 3, which is the plastic products. And so it's highly bracketed. So just know that that's definitely an active conversation. However, there's also requirements that countries measure and monitor and assess what's coming up in the environment, and certainly those data will be helpful in prioritization in any country that you're in. Secondly, measurement and monitoring and standardization is all in Article 18, and it's very generic, but it is important. And I would say that the data, we have enough data to act, but we can always use more. And we also, for the gentleman who was talking about air monitoring systems, all the monitoring efforts that we can corral now that exist are going to be important, but also the development of specific standards and such will be, that would all be, I assume, contemplated under the subsidiary body discussions, but just know that those are in the text of the chair's text, and hopefully will be something that's developed further after the agreement is put to bed.
Okay, thank you, Margaret.
Sorry, can I just have one tiny little point on
Yes,
that as well? And
okay.
I promise I'll be quick. Just going back to that point, my operations background in me says that continuous improvement, the first thing you do is count it. You can't change anything unless you can measure it. Mm-hmm. And the measuring it is important, and I think from an industry point of view, in countries that are developed, that we talked about, and I hate using the word developed and undeveloped because they're just countries that are developed in a different way. But if you look at the sort of big economies, it's fully accepted. There's a lot of information that gets passed, because actually, if you're building infrastructure in some of these countries, if you put in 1,000 tons of products of whatever category onto the market, it's no good having bins that are 1 ton capacity. Mm. If we want to capture it, you have to have the full capacity, and it's going to start with actually understanding what is on the market. So it's not just about the waste, it's about the whole infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador Sophia, did you want to add anything?
I wanted
briefly
to make a final
before-
point.
Okay,
Yeah,
final point,
just
great.
without repeating, just to really support everything that P.S. Michael has said around his response to some of the last three questions, particularly on how we're treating the consideration of what many may think are a low-hanging fruits within Article 3 and the listing of products, but not just products. We've seen specific chemicals being considered as part of the discussion as well. And interestingly enough, at the recent HODs, we've seen some of the more difficult countries considering what an initial list could look like. And so this is all very progressive, considering where we left off in Busan. So really, really helpful going into Geneva that, as PS said, that we don't have any opposition towards the inclusion of a list. It's really how we set the criteria for additional products and chemicals, if you do get to that point, to be considered in the future. And of course, as Margaret said, that all depends on the technical body that we will be supporting following the treaty to advance some of these procedures. On the note of plastic credits, and just very final point, and it goes back to the initial point that PS made, when we talk about financing within the context of this agreement, it's new and additional, right? And new and additional does not mean innovative financing that may work in a context but is not viable for SIDS. And it's something that we constantly repeat. We had the fantastic technical session last year where we had an opportunity to add technical resource experts questions on the viability of some of these mechanisms that are being proposed. And it was great that in full transparency and candor, they were able to share that many of these may not be applicable for SIDS. And what we don't want is to be forced into channeling resources to build structures for mechanisms that really don't allow us to implement the obligations that we've all agreed to. So just a word of caution here is, while we are approaching Article 11 in the spirit of multilateralism and with the knowledge that there are elements that we need to compromise on, there are certain things that we will not compromise on. And so we're not going to put empty words into a treaty to satisfy certain positions simply because this is what we've done traditionally. We are very clear that this needs to be implementable, it needs to be effective, and it needs to consider what works for small island developing states.
Yeah, I just want to bring this into perspective as well. I mean, it's good that the question on plastics credits has come up. And because it's, I think for PCs in particular, we did mention this about, the risk of greenwashing, where companies actually can claim to be plastic neutral and then simply funding cleanup somewhere. Then this is actually about shifting the burden to the global south, where waste pickers are currently underpaid, underprotected, and so forth, and exploiting our waste sector. I think it links to the previous point on the colleague that has asked on ISO, because when you talk about plastic credits, there is really no global standard or governance that has an agreed definition, that has a verified system or transparent mechanism to do this. So it brings into place the risk of double counting, unverifiable claims, and so forth. And I think these are genuine concerns that we have, because it is not something that has worked, that will work perhaps in the next decade or so, or many 2 decades in a region like the Pacific, because even when Bitcoin and other things came in, we were one region that did not engage with this because we knew that its viability did not exist in our market. And so these are the realities, the differences of developing global south that you really need to take into perspective when you are talking about innovative finance and what it looks like. Maybe it looks very nice, freshy-washy in the global north, and it's very different for us here in this side of the world. And so we need to make it very practical and have very realistic, pragmatic implementation pathways for finance.
And just a final point is that we really want to be able to support our the inclusion of our traditional knowledge and implementation approaches and a local knowledge as well, and having the flexibility through the financing mechanism to be able to support that at the national level is really, really important to us as well.
Okay, great. Thank you for these detailed answers. And thanks everyone for staying. You realize you're in a room with negotiators who are not afraid to go into extra time. So, but please, final remarks over to Ambassador Valles.
Thank you, Patrick. Well, to tell you that, I'm optimistic about this. I think we will have a very important, of course, with some challenges sessions in Geneva, but listening to Safia, to Michael, to Margaret, to Jeremy, I get even more optimistic about this. And because there is many Safias, Michaels, Margarets, and Jeremys, wanted to have this very effective treaty by the end of Geneva, wanted to have an ambitious implementation as soon as possible. And for that, I have presented to the members a scenario note a few days ago, actually 3 days ago, that is my proposals of the organization of work that I propose to the members to use it in Geneva. I think what you will see in that scenario note, well, and there are different things about the organization of work, but it's something that for me is quite important, that is to advance permanently during the negotiations in Geneva. I want to see permanent progress in our negotiations. If we do find a challenge or something that is stopping us to advance, like we would like to see, that all of us would like to see in Geneva, we need to work it out. We need to see how we make it and to have a good, effective treaty by the end of our session in Geneva. Today is the 14th of July. In 1 month, that means the 14th of August, the world will see very good news, and you will hear very good news from Geneva when we will make this reality an effective treaty that will combat and end plastic pollution. Thank you very much, Patrick.
Thank you very much.